The stories that we're going to share today come to us from the Old Testament, from the book of 1 Samuel. We're going to be looking at some different passages from 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 17. So we really want to encourage you at home or sometime this week, sit down and read a few of those passages. So, let me tell you something about myself. When I was in elementary school, I've probably told this story many times, but I was always the last kid that was chosen. I mean, back in elementary school, I was just this skinny, wiry little kid who was very uncoordinated. And when it came time to choose teams, I was usually the last kid that was chosen. And oftentimes when it was time to choose the last two people, whoever was choosing would say, you can have him and whoever else is over there. And that was just sort of the way things weren't. I just always was sort of overlooked because of being that scrawny little kid, and nobody wanted me on their team. Sort of sounds like this guy. NFL scouts back in the draft in 2000 didn't think much of this guy, and I don't know how well you can see that picture, but he was the 199th player selected that year. There were 6 other quarterbacks who were taken ahead of him, and whether you love this guy or hate him, yeah, I'm one of those haters. You have to admit that there are a lot of NFL teams who overlooked this guy who last week won his 7th Super Bowl ring. We'll get rid of that picture because we don't want to look at it any longer. But whether we're at home, whether we're at work, whether we're in the neighborhood, you know, it's easy to overlook the people that we do life with. It's easy to overlook the people that we do life with. I mean, it's easy. I mean, it's easy to overlook your spouse and your children and your coworkers and your neighbors. Maybe if you're joining us online, maybe you want to just comment about someone that's easy to overlook. No names, please, but just if you have some thoughts there. But you know, it's easy to overlook people. I mean, we overlook the people who serve us all the time. It's easy to overlook the people who are homeless. You know, we just drive by and don't think anything of them. Because you see, we live in this fast-paced, it's all about me kind of a world, and it's just easy to overlook people. But when we overlook people, what happens is we fail to honor people. And we fail, when we fail to see them, we fail to see them as a person who is created in the image of God and therefore worthy of our honor and respect. When we overlook people, we miss a gift. We miss a gift that's oftentimes right in front of us. And when we overlook people, we miss the opportunity that God places in front of us, an opportunity to be a blessing, and oftentimes, I think, an opportunity to be blessed. So David was one of those people who was overlooked. Long before David was lauded for killing Goliath, long before David was crowned the next king of Israel, David was first and foremost the youngest son of Jesse. And sometimes it's easy to miss the youngest, especially if he's not in the room. So as I said, you can follow along with this story in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 17, but let me set the stage for you. The prophet Samuel arrives in Bethlehem. Samuel had been sent by God to anoint a new king for Israel. And it was sort of a clandestine kind of thing that Samuel was doing because Israel already had a king. And all Samuel knew was that he was supposed to go to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, and to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be the king. And so Samuel arrives in Bethlehem, and he invites Jesse to bring his sons and come to a barbecue. Now, remember, all Samuel knows is he is there to find the next king. He doesn't know who it is. All he knows is that it's got to be one of Jesse's sons. Now, this is what 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 6 tells us. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. Surely this is the Lord's anointed. Now, we can assume, because we know a little bit about how people were chosen as kings back in those days, we can surmise that Eliab is some tall, well-groomed, strapping young man. Because in those days, when you chose a king, you wanted to choose somebody who could lead an army in battle. And after all, what we learn is that when Israel chose their first king, King Saul, the guy who was king right now, he was described as being a foot taller than everyone else. And that was a perfect reason to make him the king. Now, isn't this sort of how we oftentimes make decisions about people? We see what's on the outside. We see their outside characteristics, and we assume that anyone who stands out because they're beautiful, because they're tall, because they just have this air about them, we assume that anyone who stands out, somebody that sets themselves apart for some reason, has to be the best choice to lead. But you may remember this. You may have heard this before. This is what God said to Samuel when he took one look at Eliab. He said, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance. Say this with me, this last line. But the Lord looks at the heart. But the Lord looks at the heart. It's easy. It's easy for us. We just naturally look at people, at outward appearances, but we totally miss what's inside. I mean, that was the case with King Saul. He was a head taller than everybody else, so he was the perfect one. He was a good warrior. But what about Saul's heart? What about his character? That left something to be desired, and that's why God had rejected Saul and sent Samuel to anoint a new king. Now, what we find out here in the beginning of the story here in 1 Samuel chapter 16 is that Jesse had his sons walk past Samuel. And every son that walked past, God said no to each one. And so after going through 7 sons, Samuel the prophet looks at Jesse and he says, is that it? Do you have any more sons? Now you can sort of imagine, if you came from a big family, you can imagine that Jesse is probably stopping there and he's thinking, well, I got that one and that one and that one. Oh yeah, there's the little guy who's out taking care of the sheep. And so what does Samuel do? Samuel says, hey, send for him before we sit down to eat. And so David comes, and you can sort of imagine, if you've ever had older brothers, you can probably imagine their disgust whenever little David comes walking into the room, and they've been having to wait for him. You know, they're probably looking down at this scrawny little brother of theirs, and as he walks into the room, Samuel hears God say, that's him. He's the one. He's the next king. And as I said, it's easy to overlook people. It's easy to overlook people, especially the youngest among us, and miss the opportunity that we have to honor that person. So what I want to do now is just sort of take you through a look at David's life and just take a look at all of the different ways that David was overlooked by different people. Because there is a lesson here, not only for those of us who may overlook people, but there's a lesson for those who feel that they are overlooked. Now, we're going to start with David's father, okay? David was overlooked by his father, Jesse. Jesse sort of represents all of us who make judgments about people based upon their outward appearance and our opinion of that particular person. Okay, remember, Samuel shows up and he says to Jesse, I want you to bring all your sons to the dinner we're going to have. Now, this is sort of reminiscent of Home Alone, you know. You sort of left somebody behind in your rush to get on with life, right? Jesse left David in the field. In Jesse's mind, David didn't rise to the point of being at the table with the big boys. So can you think of a time when someone overlooked you? Can you think of a time when someone overlooked you, a time that someone passed over you because in their opinion, you didn't have what was needed? You didn't have the outward characteristics that were needed. You didn't have what they thought you needed to have. But maybe you need to think about it this way. Can you think of a time when you overlooked someone because in your opinion, they didn't belong at the table? Because outwardly, they didn't appear to have what you wanted. Now, unfortunately, the actions of Jesse didn't just stop with Jesse. They got passed on to his sons as well. And this account is really fleshed out for us in 1 Samuel chapter 17, where David is given a task by his father. He is to carry some food to supply his brothers who were in a battle. And this is the story of where David begins his opportunity to confront Goliath. But long before the battle, David arrives, and as David approaches, Goliath is coming out, and Goliath is beginning his daily tirade about how he is challenging all of the army to send out one man to fight him so that whoever wins, they get to rule over the other nation. Now, David is indignant, first of all, when he hears Goliath's taunts, but he's also, I think, indignant because of the fact that Israel's army didn't send anybody out. In David's mind, how dare a Philistine defy the armies of the living God? Now, David's brother Eliab overheard all of this. He heard David spouting off about all of these things, about how he could fight the giant and how God would give him the power to do so. Remember, Eliab learned from his father to dishonor David. Listen to what Eliab said. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 28. It says that Eliab burned with anger at David. And he asked him, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few measly sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came only to watch the battle." Eliab learned something from his father's example. And Eliab ends up dishonoring David by belittling him. And sometimes our inability to see people is passed down from one generation to the next. Sometimes we're possessed with the same generational opinions of those who came before us. And I think Eliab's disdain for his brother simply caused him to be filled with jealousy, and he overlooked David just as his father had done before him. So can you think of a time that you overlooked someone because of the opinions of others? Can you think of a time when you overlooked someone because of the opinions of others? A time when jealousy caused you to be blinded to a person simply because of who they were. Think about that. Third person, King Saul. We're going to stay with this story of David and Goliath for just a moment here, but King Saul, he finds out about all the things David is boasting about, and he has David brought into his tent, and David, as he arrives there, says to King Saul, now remember, David is still a young man. Saul is this king who is a head above everybody else. And David says to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Now that's a pretty big boast from a little guy talking to the king. And listen to what Saul says in verse 33. Saul says, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." So what's Saul doing here? Saul is overlooking David. But I want you to hear something that's easy to miss. Saul was also overlooking God and the work that God was doing in and through David. Now, you can imagine Saul, okay? Remember, this big guy, he's looking down at little David. And basically what he's telling David is, David, you just are not equipped to defeat a giant like Goliath. You're not equipped to defeat a giant like Goliath. But David persists. He keeps after King Saul, and finally Saul gives in. I'm not quite sure why he does, but he gives in, but he gives him one final thing. He said, David, listen, if you're going to go and fight the giant, put on my armor. Put on my armor. You see, Saul looked at David, and I think what's going through Saul's mind is, maybe if you dress like me, maybe if you put on my armor, then you'll have a chance. And I think in that little encounter there, Saul represents how oftentimes we expect people to be like us. We expect people to be like us. If they're going to succeed, they have to be like me. And what happens then is that we don't see people for their skills and their abilities because they're not like us. So have you experienced a Saul in your life? Someone who expects you to be just like them if you're going to succeed? That you have to have the same gifts, the same talents, the same abilities? Have you missed an opportunity to see someone use their talents because you expected them to tackle a problem the same way you would tackle the problem? Well, there's one more person, Goliath. Yeah, Goliath overlooked David. Real simple part of the story. I mean, all Goliath can see is this skinny little kid who has no armor, who's coming at him with nothing more than a sling and a few stones. Goliath was like everybody else in David's story. He couldn't see anything of David's outward appearance that would make him shake in his boots. He couldn't see anything except the outward appearance. Goliath, though, couldn't see God at work in David. But we all know how the story ends, right? We all know how the story of David and Goliath ends. You see, it's easy for many reasons to overlook the people around us. But just remember this: the person that you overlook may be the next king. So I want to begin to wrap things up by, first of all, talking to anybody today who feels like they're overlooked. I think when you look at David's story, you find an example of how you need to conduct your life even if you feel that you are constantly being overlooked. And here's what we learn. Here's what we learn from David's life. Okay? First of all, David had an inward character that God saw. Maybe nobody else sees it, but God saw it. And if you feel like you're always being overlooked, here's where you need to start. On the inside, with your inward character. The second thing that we see when we look at David's life is that David used his talents. He used his talents, exactly the talents that God gave him, in the place where he was. I love when David is talking to Saul, he tells Saul, he says, "Listen, Saul, I've been a shepherd for a long time, and as a shepherd, I have had to kill a bear and a lion." Okay? He said, "I've been faithful, and God has provided for me to use these talents that I have where I have been used, where I've been at work." He used his talents. The third thing is he didn't try and be anybody else. David didn't try and be anybody else. David was just himself. He was himself because he knew that he couldn't be King Saul, and he knew he didn't want to be like his brother. He was himself. And the final thing is that he kept his eyes on who God is and believed that God could do great things through him. So if you're someone who feels like you're always overlooked, build the inward character, the things that God sees. Use your talents where you're at. Be the best at what you can do. Don't try and be anybody else. Be you, because that's who God made you to be. And keep your eyes on God, because God believes that you can do great things through his power. Now that's for the overlooked. How about the rest of us? The rest of us who probably have a tendency to overlook the people around us. And I think we all do this in some way at some time. But first of all, I think we need to learn not to miss the least. Don't miss the littlest among us. Those who may have a special place in God's purpose. It's easy to miss the least, to think that they don't have a part to play, but they certainly do. So don't overlook the littlest among us. Second of all, we may discover that those we generalize as being less are capable of more than we could imagine. There are people who are capable of so much more than we think is possible. So stop just generalizing people and see people for who they truly are as individuals. Number 3, we may discover that people have their own gifts and talents that God can use. They have their own gifts and talents that God can use. You know, everybody's unique. Everybody's different. And that's important for us to realize. Everybody isn't going to have the same gifts and talents, but God can still use them. So recognize those gifts. Recognize those talents. Bring the best out in those people. And last but not least, we have to discover that God is at work in ways that you and I may not be able to perceive from the outside. God is doing something on the inside in somebody's life. You may not recognize it on the outside, but you need to recognize that God is at work. I was thinking today about school teachers. And the fact that there probably have been so many school teachers who can think back to some of the students who were sitting in their class at one point and thinking to themselves that this poor child, I don't know how this poor child is going to succeed. And yet, a few years later, maybe a decade down the road, they think back and they see what this child has achieved, and they're just sort of like, never would have imagined. I never would have imagined. I bet if I were to ask all of you who are school teachers to tell me a story about somebody like that, I bet you could tell me a story like that. You see, in David's story, Jesse and Eliab and King Saul and Goliath, they all overlooked David. All in their own unique ways, they overlook David, and they all represent the way in which you and I can fall into the trap of not honoring the people that we overlook. You see, God saw what no one else could see in David. And as a corollary to this, and we don't have time to go into this, but David saw what no one else could see about God. There's a big truth there that we need to understand. See, God saw what no one else could see in David. God didn't overlook the little boy who was watching the sheep. God saw David's heart, and God honored David by exalting him to the place where he became the next king of Israel. So that leads me to ask you this very simple question. Who have you been overlooking? Who have you been overlooking? Realize something. The person that you've been overlooking may be a giant killer. They may be the next king. And if we miss the opportunity to see them as such, we may even miss the opportunity to see God at work. Would you join me in a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you for the way that you have crafted each and every one of us. You've crafted us uniquely, and you've crafted us in ways that maybe others don't see the gifts and the graces and the talents that we have in our lives, but truly you do. And you have a purpose. You have a plan for how we can use our lives. And I pray, Lord, that we might recognize that you never overlook even the smallest things. And so, Lord, I pray that today we might not overlook anybody. And I pray that we might recognize that within us lies a great reservoir of things that you want to do in this world that only we can do. So I pray for those who are overlooked that today they might see in David an example. And I pray that for each of us who may tend to overlook people, that we might learn that lesson as well. And as we do, Lord, may we seek to honor one another. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, let me give you three quick things to think about here when it comes to how you can apply some of today's lesson. Okay? Three things, real quick. First of all, look for the things to celebrate in other people. Look for things to celebrate in other people. You know, a lot of times we don't stop and celebrate, and we don't stop and encourage the things that that are strong talents and gifts that other people have. This sort of leads into the next one, which is to build up the skills and interests of others. You know, as a parent, sometimes you have kids that have interests and skills, and you're just like, I don't understand where that comes from, and I don't understand how to nurture it. Don't ignore it. Build into it. Help them to discover those skills and their interests, even when you don't understand it. Final thing, find regular opportunities for everyone's voice to be heard. You know, if you're sitting around a table, make sure that everybody's voice gets heard at the table. Don't let anybody out. And if somebody's quiet at the table, draw them out, because you never know. You never know what that quiet person might be holding inside.